When one bad decision leads to death on Mount Everest. YouTube. https://www.youtube.com/watch?mark v=KOG5CBLARR0. Transcript 00:00. The Himalayas have always been humanity's ultimate test, towering peaks where dreams and nightmares collide in the thin air above 26,000 feet. Here stands a horrific story, from a guide that chose profit over caution to a doctor that sacrifices herself trying to save someone who should never have been there. It was May 22, 2019, 0022. The Cornish Traverse above the Hillary Step of Mount Everest had become humanity's highest traffic jam, a bottleneck at 28,839 feet where dreams and death certificates were issued with equal efficiency. Here, in the planet's most unforgiving environment, a series of calculated risks would cascade into one of the deadliest single expedition disasters in Everest's modern history. 0045, a tragedy that would expose the dark economics of high-altitude mountaineering and rewrite the rules of expedition leadership forever. At 29,032 feet above sea level, Mount Everest carved its way through the Himalayas like a monument to human ambition and folly. The narrow ridges, hemmed in by towering ice formations and fed by the temperamental weather systems of the Indian subcontinent, had witnessed decades of human struggle against the mountain's savage moods. Its Tibetan name, Chomolunga, goddess mother of the world, carried a reverence that belied the mountain's transformation into a commercial playground, where paying clients could purchase their way to the world's highest summit. Since Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay first reached the summit in 1953, over 10,000 successful ascents had been recorded, but the mountain's appetite for human life remained unchanged. Over 300 climbers had died attempting to reach the top, creating a fatality rate that hovered around 1% of all attempts. But what draws hundreds to risk everything for a summit that kills 1 in every 100 who attempted? The mountain's position at the intersection of Nepal and Tibet created weather patterns that defied prediction. Jet streams that could reach 200 miles per hour in winter dropped to dangerous altitudes during the brief spring climbing season, creating windows of opportunity measured in hours rather than days. The western CWM, a massive glacial valley that served as the highway to the upper mountain, channeled these winds into a funnel that could transform calm conditions into deadly storms within minutes. In 2019, Nepal had issued a record 381 permits for Everest's south side, leading to unprecedented crowding that would be widely blamed for the spike in fatalities that year. The resulting traffic jams in the death zone, the area above 8,000 meters where the human body cannot acclimatize, would transform routine summit attempts into deadly waiting games. But Everest still held one quality that drew outsiders to its dramatic landscape: the ultimate test of human will against impossible odds, now packaged and sold for $65,000 per client. But why would experienced guides risk everything for clients who treated the world's highest peak like an expensive adventure vacation? 41-year-old Victoria Kane had already achieved what most mountain guides spend lifetimes pursuing. Born into a family of outdoor enthusiasts in Colorado, the younger Kane had carved out her own identity in high-altitude guiding through performances that captured the essence of technical excellence with raw determination. Her childhood had been spent in the shadow of Colorado's 14ers, where her father worked as a search and rescue coordinator for the state's mountain rescue teams. Victoria had learned early that the mountains demanded respect, preparation, and an understanding that nature always held the final vote in any climbing equation. Her breakthrough moment had come during her first Everest summit in 2015, where she had successfully guided 2 clients to the top without incident. The achievement had made her a respected figure across Colorado's climbing community, but Victoria had never been satisfied with conventional success. The transition had not been smooth. Victoria's first season as an expedition leader in 2018 had been plagued by weather delays and client complaints about her conservative approach. 2 clients had demanded partial refunds, claiming that Victoria's safety-first mentality had cost them their summit opportunities. The financial hit had been devastating, forcing Victoria to mortgage her home to fund the 2019 season. Her latest project, a 3-client expedition to Everest, represented her most ambitious undertaking yet. The mountain's reputation for sudden weather changes, commercial overcrowding, and objective dangers made it the ultimate test for any serious guide. Supporting the expedition was a team of experienced Sherpa climbers led by Pembe Sherpa, a veteran of 12 Everest summits who served as Sirar, head Sherpa. The Sherpa team included Angkor and Tenzin, both experienced high-altitude workers responsible for rope fixing, camp establishment and client safety. Sherpas had become the backbone of Himalayan expeditions, often fixing ropes, carrying loads and making summit pushes possible for foreign climbers. Yet they faced disproportionate risks. Sherpas were statistically more likely to die on Everest than foreign climbers. Despite earning a fraction of what clients paid for their expeditions, what none of them knew was that 1,000 feet above their final camp, the mountain was preparing to unleash forces that had been building for weeks. But why would a mountain that had been climbed successfully thousands of times suddenly become a killer? The Cornes traverse above the old Hillary Step location had never been predictable. Unlike the stable climbing routes found on other peaks, this section belonged to a rare and dangerous category known as high-altitude bottlenecks. Technical obstacles prone to sudden catastrophic overcrowding. The destruction of the Hillary Step in the 2015 earthquake had created new challenges that climbers were still learning to navigate. The replacement route, a steep snow and ice slope, was technically easier than the original rock face, but more prone to dangerous overcrowding, as expeditions attempted to move large groups through the section quickly. By May 2019, this new route had been climbed successfully hundreds of times, but the traverse had extended its reputation for difficulty through the commercial traffic that now defined modern Everest climbing. The section required climbers to traverse steep exposed terrain while clipped into fixed ropes that were maintained by rotating teams of Sherpa rope fixers. But the 2019 season was different. Deep within the mountains, weather patterns, a brief 72-hour window was slowly forming, creating conditions that would force over 200 climbers to attempt the summit during the same narrow time frame. The death zone above 8,000 meters was so hostile to human life that the body began to deteriorate even at rest. Most climbers could only survive for 16 to 20 hours at these altitudes before irreversible damage occurred. At the summit, atmospheric pressure was only about 1/3 of sea level, and each breath delivered only a fraction of the oxygen needed to survive. But what happens when every team on the mountain is forced to climb at the same time? Meteorological analysis would later reveal that the mountain had been showing warning signs for days before the disaster. Weather teams at base camp had reported widespread uncertainty and increasing instability throughout the spring of 2019. The first sign of catastrophe came not as a visual warning, but as a radio transmission that seemed to emerge from the very heart of the mountain's commercial machinery. Victoria was reviewing final preparations at Camp 4 when she received what she later described in her expedition notes as a weather update that compressed favorable conditions into a narrow window. Conditions that would force every expedition on the mountain to summit during the same 3-day period. That optimism would not be enough. Amanda Cross was the kind of client who represented both the best and worst of commercial high-altitude climbing. The 35-year-old investment banker had made her fortune during the financial boom and was now pursuing Everest as a personal challenge that would complement her professional success. Cross had approached mountaineering with the same analytical intensity that had made her successful in finance. She had hired personal trainers, studied altitude physiology, and completed a rigorous training program that included climbs on Denali and Ankwa, the highest peaks in North and South America, at 20,310 and 22,841 feet respectively. Her preparation had been thorough and expensive, reflecting her belief that proper planning could overcome any obstacle. But neither Denali nor Aconcagua presented the same physiological challenges as Everest's death zone, where the human body simply could not adapt to the lack of oxygen. But Cross's professional success had also instilled in her an impatience with delays and a confidence in her ability to push through difficulties that concerned Victoria. During the expedition's acclimatization phase, Cross had repeatedly questioned conservative decisions and had pushed for more aggressive timelines. Jennifer Walsh represented the expedition's voice of reason. The 44-year-old emergency room physician brought medical expertise and methodical decision-making to a team that would desperately need both qualities in the hours ahead. Walsh's medical background had given her a unique perspective on the risks of high-altitude climbing. She understood that high-altitude cerebral edema and high-altitude pulmonary edema were the two most deadly altitude illnesses, both capable of developing rapidly and proving fatal above 8,000 meters without immediate descent. Her presence on the expedition provided both medical expertise and a conservative voice that balanced Cross's aggressive approach. Robert Thompson was the expedition's concern. The 58-year-old retired firefighter brought decades of emergency response experience, but his body was showing signs that high-altitude mountaineering might be beyond his physical capabilities. During the expedition's early phases, Thompson had struggled more than expected with the altitude. His acclimatization had been slower than normal, and he had experienced persistent headaches and sleep difficulties that concerned both Victoria and the medical team at base camp. But how do you tell a client who has paid $65,000 and trained for years that they are not fit to continue? During the pre-climb medical evaluation at base camp, situated at 17,600 feet on the Khumbu Glacier, expedition staff had noted that Thompson was showing early signs of altitude-related complications. Mild headaches, disrupted sleep patterns, and slower than normal acclimatization responses had prompted medical recommendations for additional time at altitude. Pembe Sherpa had privately expressed concerns to Victoria about Thompson's condition, noting that his oxygen consumption during acclimatization climbs was significantly higher than normal, a warning sign that experienced Sherpas recognized as potentially dangerous. Generations of mountain experience had taught the Sherpa community to spot subtle signs of trouble before Western guides, thanks to their deep understanding of the mountain's moods. The weather window was the most critical component of any Everest expedition, designed to provide the safest possible conditions for summit attempts. But the 2019 weather window was showing clear signs of compression that should have triggered extended delays. The forecast indicated only 72 hours of acceptable conditions before winds exceeding 60 miles per hour were expected, a narrow window that would force multiple expeditions to summit simultaneously. The compressed timeline created a cascade of problems that experienced guides recognized but felt powerless to address. With dozens of expeditions targeting the same narrow window, the upper mountain would become dangerously overcrowded. But delaying meant missing the season entirely, with financial consequences that could destroy a guide service. But how much faith should you place in a weather forecast when your business success depends on getting clients to the summit? Victoria's decision to proceed with a compressed timeline represented a compromise between client satisfaction and risk management. As a commercial guide, Victoria was dependent on client payments and positive reviews for her business survival. The expedition was already 2 days behind schedule due to earlier weather delays. Financial pressure was mounting as clients had paid $65,000 each and were threatening to demand refunds if they missed the climb. At 11 p.m. on May 21st, Victoria, her 3 clients and the Sherpa team began their summit push from Camp 4 at 26,000 feet. Despite growing concerns about the compressed weather window, 12 other expeditions were following similar timelines, creating the conditions for unprecedented overcrowding. Each climber carried 2 oxygen bottles for the summit push, with additional bottles cached at the South Pole for the descent. 12:38. Supplemental oxygen was considered essential above 8,000 meters for most climbers, as the human body consumed oxygen at a rate that could deplete a standard bottle in as little as 4 to 6 hours if delays occurred. The oxygen management plan called for bottle changes at specific altitudes, but the system depended on maintaining the planned timeline. 12:57. Running out of oxygen in the death zone was almost always fatal. The ascent proceeded normally for the first 4 hours, with Thompson managing to keep pace despite showing signs of fatigue that concerned both Victoria and Pembe. At the Kones traverse above the old Hillary Step location, Everest's current bottleneck, the true scope of the disaster became apparent. Over 150 climbers from dozens of expeditions had converged on the narrow technical section, creating a traffic jam that stretched for 200 meters. The scene that greeted Victoria's team was unlike anything she had experienced in her previous Everest expeditions. Viral photos from the 2019 season would later show climbers lined up nose to back on the summit ridge, waiting for hours in the death zone while their oxygen supplies dwindled and their bodies deteriorated. But what happens when the mountain's most dangerous section becomes a parking lot? The traverse required climbers to move one at a time across steep exposed terrain while clipped into fixed ropes. Under normal conditions, the section could be completed in 30 to 45 minutes, but with over 150 climbers attempting to pass through simultaneously, the wait time stretched to hours. At 7:30 a.m. 1411, while waiting in the queue that had formed below the traverse, a delay that experienced climbers had learned to expect, the expedition encountered conditions that transformed inconvenience into catastrophe. The traffic jam was not simply crowded, it was a complex mixture of exhausted climbers, depleted oxygen supplies, and deteriorating weather conditions that created a grinding, crushing environment where every minute of delay increased the risk of death. 1437. Climbers were burning through their oxygen supplies while standing still, their bodies working overtime to function in the thin air. The extreme cold was sapping energy and making equipment handling increasingly difficult. Frostbite became a real concern as climbers waited motionless in temperatures that reached -40 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. The psychological pressure was as dangerous as the physical challenges. Climbers who had trained for years and spent tens of thousands of dollars found themselves trapped in a situation beyond their control, watching their summit dreams slip away as their oxygen supplies dwindled. Thompson was the first to show signs of serious distress. At 8:45 a.m., still 300 meters from the summit, with his second oxygen bottle running lower than planned due to the extended delay, he began displaying symptoms of high-altitude cerebral edema, confusion, loss of coordination, and impaired judgment. The symptoms had developed gradually over the previous hour, but they accelerated rapidly once they began. Thompson's speech became slurred and he began making mistakes with his equipment that could have been fatal. He clipped his ascender to the wrong side of the fixed rope twice, requiring correction from Ang Dorch. Dr. Walsh, recognizing the medical emergency, made the decision to begin immediate descent with Thompson while Babu Sherpa assisted. 1555. Her medical training told her that rapid descent was the only effective treatment for cerebral edema. Medications like dexamethasone could buy time, but without descent, death was almost certain. But when is it right to turn back? How do you balance the dreams of one client against the life of another? Victoria maintained radio contact with base camp throughout the crisis, using both handheld radios and the expedition's satellite phone to coordinate rescue efforts and weather updates. 1622. Victoria faced a critical choice: abort the entire expedition to assist with the medical emergency or continue with Cross while the Sherpa team managed Thompson's descent. She chose to continue with Cross, believing that Pembea and Dr. Walsh had the situation under control and that aborting would waste the narrow weather window. 1640. The decision reflected the impossible pressures facing commercial guides on Everest. Victoria's responsibility to her clients conflicted with her responsibility to Thompson, and there was no clear right answer. The choice she made would haunt her for the rest of her life. Ang Dorch and Tenzin began the complex process of assisting Thompson's descent, while Dr. 1700 Walsh monitored his condition. The traffic jam made rapid descent impossible, forcing them to wait in the death zone while Thompson's condition deteriorated. Victoria and Cross reached the summit at 11:45 a.m., still within acceptable timing despite the delays. Weather conditions were holding steady, but the extended time in the death zone was taking its toll on everyone involved. 1722. But the mountain was not finished claiming lives. The descent would prove that reaching the summit was only half the challenge. During the descent, Victoria received a radio transmission from Pamba that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Thompson had lost consciousness at 8,200 meters, and Dr. Walsh was showing signs of severe exhaustion from the rescue effort. Cross, pushing herself beyond her limits during the descent, began showing signs of severe altitude sickness at 8,400 meters. Her speech became slurred, her coordination deteriorated, and she began making dangerous mistakes on technical terrain. The symptoms suggested that Cross was experiencing high-altitude pulmonary edema, a condition where fluid accumulates in the lungs, making breathing increasingly difficult. The condition was often fatal if not treated immediately with descent and oxygen. Victoria, trying to manage Cross's condition while coordinating with the Sherpa team below, found herself stretched beyond her capabilities as a single guide, managing multiple emergencies simultaneously. The final hours were a cascade of individual tragedies that unfolded across the mountain's upper slopes. Thompson died at 8,100 meters, despite Dr. Walsh's heroic efforts to keep him alive during the descent. The combination of cerebral edema and the extended time in the death zone had overwhelmed his body's ability to survive. Pembe later described Thompson's final moments as peaceful. The retired firefighter had lost consciousness gradually, his breathing becoming shallower until it simply stopped. Dr. Walsh had continued CPR efforts long after it was clear that Thompson was gone, her medical training refusing to accept defeat even in the face of impossible odds. Dr. Walsh, exhausted from the rescue effort and her own extended time at extreme altitude, collapsed at 7,900 meters. Pembe and Ag Dorj managed to get her to Camp 4, but she died from pulmonary edema 8 hours later. Dr. Walsh's death was particularly tragic because it was preventable. Her medical knowledge had told her that she needed to descend immediately when she began showing symptoms of altitude sickness, but her commitment to saving Thompson had overridden her self-preservation instincts. Cross made it to 8,000 meters before her condition became critical. Victoria, faced with her own depleted oxygen supply and Cross's deteriorating state, made the agonizing decision to continue the descent while radioing for emergency assistance. The decision to leave Cross was the most difficult of Victoria's climbing career. Cross was conscious but barely coherent, and Victoria knew that staying with her would likely result in both of their deaths. The choice between certain death for both or possible survival for one was no choice at all. Cross died at 7,800 meters, her body found by a rescue team the following day in a position that suggested she had simply sat down to rest and never gotten up. Victoria survived the descent, reaching Camp 2 at 21,300 feet in a state of severe exhaustion, but conscious and able to communicate. A ground-based rescue team reached her position and assisted her descent to base camp, where she was treated for frostbite and dehydration. Helicopter rescues above Camp 2 were rare but possible in perfect weather conditions. Most rescues on Everest were performed by Sherpas and other climbers, not by air, making Victoria's survival dependent on the courage and skill of the mountain's unsung heroes. The traffic jam had claimed its victims, but Everest's appetite for tragedy was far from satisfied. The mountain had demonstrated that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from natural forces, but from human systems that prioritize profit over safety. But how do you mourn someone whose death was caused by a traffic jam in the sky? The official casualty count reached 3 confirmed victims from Victoria's expedition. 2114. Thompson, Walsh and Cross. Their bodies remain on the mountain, serving as permanent reminders of the day when commercial mountaineering's darkest impulses were exposed at 29,000 feet. More than 200 bodies remained on Everest, many visible from the main climbing routes. The cost and risk of recovery were so high that most were left where they fell, becoming permanent fixtures in what climbers grimly called Rainbow Valley, a reference to the colorful down jackets that marked the locations of the dead. 2142. The 2019 season would ultimately claim 11 lives on Everest, making it one of the deadliest climbing seasons in the mountain's modern history. The deaths sparked international debate about the commercialization of Everest and the ethics of high-altitude guiding. Bodies remained on the mountain due to extreme recovery conditions and prohibitive costs exceeding $200,000 per body. The logistics of high-altitude body recovery in the death zone made most retrieval attempts more dangerous than the original climbing accidents. Pembe Sherpa, who survived the tragedy, later testified that the deaths were preventable if the expedition had turned back when Thompson first showed signs of altitude sickness. His testimony led to new industry standards requiring immediate descent for any client showing symptoms of cerebral or pulmonary edema. A note found in Victoria's gear documented the deteriorating conditions and her struggle with the impossible decisions faced by commercial guides. She accepted responsibility for continuing the summit attempt while her clients were in distress, acknowledging that commercial pressure had influenced her judgment. The note was written during her recovery at base camp. Her words a warning about the commercialization of extreme mountaineering that had transformed the world's highest peak into humanity's most expensive graveyard. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.